about to do something a little different. I'm here in Washington, D.C. I'm headed down into the metro where I'm going to take a train to the National Air and Space Museum. I don't know about you guys, this channel's about motorcycling and mechanics and tools and that kind of thing. And one thing I really dig and always have is motorcycles and pretty much anything on two wheels. Another thing I really dig is airplanes. This is not going to be a change in, God, these are amazing escalator. It's the biggest escalator I've ever been on. I'm not going to be changing the content of my channel to airplanes, but I thought, for once, let's go see some amazing aircraft and machines, and I'm going to look at these planes from the perspective of a mechanic, from the perspective of somebody who loves the way engineers put machines together and make them function. So, welcome to Urban Monk TV. Okay, so having taken the metro or the subway in New York City often, I gotta say this metro here in Washington, D.C. is really clean and amazing. I'll show you guys this space a little bit. Big hole in the ground. So what I will say right off the bat is that the National Air and Space Museum has two locations. I'm only going to one, kind of the original one that's on the National Mall. There is another location that has some of the larger aircraft and frankly has a larger exhibit, I believe. Big planes like the Enola Gay B-29 that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima is at the other location, but I think I'm going to see some amazing aircraft that I'll be able to share with you, and I'm going to look at them from the perspective of a mechanic. So we'll be looking for some nuances in the machines themselves and how they're designed and how the engineers overcame challenges and found solutions. The other thing I want to say is thank you to all of you who subscribed to my channel recently. I did reach my 10,000 subscriber mark, and I'm thrilled about that. And so my sincere thanks to everyone who has subscribed ever to this channel. We're going to keep this up, and in fact, I would say that the number of posts that I do is going to increase at the end of this summer. Not that I'm not going to post this summer, posting right now, right? But I will be posting more as my kids go off to college. It's going to free me up and I'm going to have more time. And I've got a lot of ideas for what I want to do on the channel. And since we are about motorcycles on this channel, it's a pretty nice ride. I could do that for a job. Actually, the riding around part I could do. The rest of the job, I don't know if I would enjoy it so much, honestly. My hat's off to those that do the job. So you might ask, well, where is the National Air and Space Museum? It's on the National Mall here in Washington, D.C. So on one end, I've got the Washington Monument. And actually beyond, you might be able to see it there, the Lincoln Memorial. It's not as tall, and further off. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the U.S. Capitol building, or Capitol Hill as they call it, which is now shrouded in some big scaffolding. So I don't know if they're refurbishing or what they're doing, but there it stands. So that's where it is. What else is here? This building behind me, you can't see it, is the National Gallery of Art. And over here behind me is the Smithsonian building. There's other things here too, but let's get to the National Air and Space Museum, which resides in this corner right over here. They do have a ticketing process. I would recommend, if you're coming, I'm here 10 minutes early and the line is already, oh my God, I mean, you can't even see the beginning of it, but I'm sure this will clear fast. But this is the line for people with tickets. So get your ticket online ahead of time, reserve your spot, which I did. Well, this story, of course, had to begin with Orville and Wilbur Wright, the bicycle manufacturers from Dayton, Ohio. And here is a rare example of a Wright bicycle. One of the first engineering differences I'm noticing is on this bicycle chain, the distance between the teeth and how unique the linkages on that chain are compared to a bicycle or a motorcycle chain, for that matter, of today. So a Wright Flyer. Couple of things I'm noticing here already is how the weight of the pilot, which is probably Orville, I would guess, and the engine offset each other. So the center line is between the two of them, and they considered the balance in weight by offsetting the engine. I have to think that they were pretty exacting about the weight of their pilot and the weight of their engine, and perhaps even those could be slid. The engine could be moved left or right, or perhaps the pilot could, to balance that better. And then I also noticed that the sprocket on that chain to these propellers, one, the gear ratio is pretty small, right? Your drive shaft and your propeller sprocket are not offset all that much differently than, say, a motorcycle, but these are obviously big props that did not spin at high RPMs. Not sure if they had bearings that could handle high RPMs. But they started using a more normal sprocket and tooth distance from that bicycle chain that we saw earlier. And they ran the chain through those tubes, I'm assuming to keep the chain from flopping around a lot, keep not necessarily tension, but maybe they needed a low tension chain, and that kept the slack from slapping. The engine was pretty crude, but it worked, obviously, and it was a very square engine, as they say. It had a 4-inch bore and a 4-inch stroke, cast iron cylinders, but a cast aluminum crankcase. And interestingly, that marked the first time that aluminum was ever used in aircraft construction. It was also a water-cooled engine, although it didn't have a radiator. It just had a large vertical reservoir that was mounted on the forward strut, and the water would just drain down onto the water jacket and evaporate from it. So there wasn't a circulation of coolant. So there's a lot of aviation museums around the world, and some have some very special aircraft in them. What's interesting here is that this is not a replica of the Wright Flyer. This is the Wright Flyer, and that is what's special about the National Air and Space Museum. Is you're typically looking at the original actual aircraft that made history. This is one of the original propellers used on the first flight at Kitty Hawk. Didn't fare so well. Though it's my understanding the Wright brothers did not understand the significance of their aircraft as a national treasure, and while they kept it, they didn't keep it in very, they weren't careful with it. So I don't know if this happened during the flight or later.
and a Ford tri-motor, which, you know, I hear you, right? Why do we call internal combustion engines motors? Motors are electric, but nonetheless, that is called a Ford tri-motor. Used to carry U.S. mail and passengers. Here's one for you, jet engine. Would you believe me if I said that this was a 4-stroke engine? Well, the word stroke isn't exactly correct, but if you think about it, these have intake, compression, power, and exhaust. The only difference is in a jet engine, they're continuous, happening all the time. This is the compressor on a jet engine. You can see how you have stationary blades with rotating blades moving between them, and it gets ever narrower. And of course, this is moving at an incredible rate of speed. The RPMs are maybe in excess of 25,000 RPM, maybe 30. I'll have to look that up. I don't even actually know. But as air moves through there as a fluid, it gets compressed. And then back here is where ignition happens, and you get the energy from the fuel added. And exhaust functions kind of the same way in that, you know, the air is expanding now as it travels through those fins, and that of course drives the shaft through the whole engine.
This is the cockpit from a McDonnell Douglas DC-7, and this represents exactly 50 years from when the Wright brothers first flew their Wright Flyer. So in 50 years, the kind of innovation and growth that occurred was quite tremendous. There would actually have been 3 people in the cockpit: a pilot, a co-pilot, and a navigator. Navigators have disappeared from commercial airliners and frankly from flying altogether, simply because of GPS, really, and we just don't need a human being doing the math all the time now. Here's a look at the first class cabin, which is obviously quite luxurious, but to my modern eyes, a couple of things stand out. One, some safety issues. There's no headrests, so in a crash, nothing's going to hold your head from slapping around and getting whiplash. 2, there's nothing containing overhead luggage in the overhead bins, so that could be flying around the cabin. And of course, there's an ashtray in every seat. Interestingly, this bathroom looks like it could be in a modern jet airliner today. The Wright brothers sold their original company to a company called Glenn Martin out of California. That later became Wright Martin, which in turn became Wright Aeronautical. And Wright Aeronautical built the Wright J5 Whirlwind, this engine you see here. It produced 220 horsepower and was considered the first modern aircraft engine. It's the engine in the Spirit of St. Louis that crossed the Atlantic, and the engine in the Ford tri-motor I showed earlier. It was the first engine to have sodium-cooled exhaust valves and to be self-lubricating, 2 technologies that the motorcycling community enjoys today. Interesting how they connect the spark plug wires and then wire them to the plug. Obviously, the air speeds flying across these surfaces is significant, and they certainly did not want a spark plug wire to become disconnected from a spark plug in flight and lose power from that cylinder. Wright Aeronautical reached a point where they refused to further develop the J5, and so the president, the chief designer, and the chief engineer left the company to work with a defunct tool company called Pratt & Whitney, and they created this engine, the Pratt & Whitney Wasp, which developed 425 horsepower with 9 cylinders and became the preferred engine for many military and commercial aircraft.
Pratt & Whitney in turn furthered the development of that design and created the Twin Wasp, which was a twin-row radial engine, eventually creating up to 1,200 horsepower. This was the engine that powered the China Clippers for Pan American Airways and really opened up trans-Pacific commercial air service. On October 25th, 1975, at Kings Island Theme Park in Ohio, a man named Robert Craig Knievel, also known as Evil Knievel, successfully jumped this motorcycle a distance of 133 feet over 14 Greyhound buses. By carefully coordinating his angle, his thrust, and his speed, which reached over 90 miles per hour at takeoff, he remained in the air as far as 165 feet, or roughly 50 meters. The bike is a 1972 Harley-Davidson XR 750. It had a dry weight of 295 pounds or 134 kilograms. It was a 748cc engine that developed about 82 horsepower, so less than my V-Strom. And how many of you had one of these toys as a kid? Leave a comment below. Don't you wish you had held on to it? In 1907, Glenn Curtiss of the Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company created this V8 motorcycle and took it to the Florida Speed Carnival, where he recorded a record-setting speed of 136 miles per hour or 218 kilometers per hour, and he was dubbed the fastest man on Earth. The engine created 30 to 40 horsepower at 1,800 RPM. Very slow rotating engine. And the last motorcycle at the National Air and Space Museum, representing the ladies of speed. In April 2016, Erin Sills rode this BMW S1000RR to a land speed record. She hit 219.3 miles per hour or 352.9 kilometers per hour from a standing start on a 1.5 mile track in the Mojave Desert in California. Okay, leaving behind engines that have an intake, compression, power, and exhaust cycles, now we're going to move on to rocket engines, which just have power, let's say. This engine is the XLR-99. It's a rocket engine. It's the most powerful engine ever installed in a piloted aircraft. This is the engine from the X-15 experimental rocket plane, essentially. This thing produces 50,000 pounds of thrust and runs on anhydrous ammonia and liquid oxygen. Okay, going further from the surface of the Earth, this Mercury space capsule was the capsule that Alan Shepard rode in to become the first American to fly into space on May 5th of 1961. Talk about a claustrophobic little tin can. Can't imagine going in this thing and strapping it to the top of a bomb, essentially. Only 4 years later, Frank Borman and James Lovell spent, get this, 14 days in this cramped Gemini cockpit. Imagine if I asked you to fly first class on a commercial airliner for 14 days. Would you say yes? Well, how about this thing? Well, getting a lot more roomy and comfortable is the Apollo 11 command module, otherwise known as Columbia. It's the only part of the spacecraft from the first moon landing expedition that returned to Earth. and it was the mothership in lunar orbit, and it carried the crew and its lunar samples through the fiery re-entry into Earth's atmosphere.
Okay, had to call it quits there. I'm out of time, but that was very interesting. Much smaller exhibit than I expected. As you can see from this illustrated map, a lot of the facility is closed for refurbishment. So, and even now, look at the line to get in, and it stretches. It's kind of amazing. Very popular place. So the National Air and Space Museum, I don't know if you can even see it behind those trees, the cranes. You know, that's what I have time to show you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this. It's a fascinating look at history of engineering, history of courageous / crazy attempts at doing things, like putting people on stuff that could kill them, but somehow we mastered it, right? I flew here, I fly all the time. I really appreciate everybody that watches this channel. No more plugs for 10,000K subscribers. I've reached that point. Thank you. And if you like what I'm doing on this channel, hit that like button and subscribe if you want to become an urban monk.